Hey everyone, it's Allie, and you don't know how excited I am to make this video. Today we're going to be talking about a build that's been waiting for years to shine once again and to become the best build in the game. Mana stacking Meteor Sorc is a build that was just on the verge of needing one or two more buffs to completely break everything and to have Meteor just delete everything on your screen in half a second. Sorcerer has been a class that has struggled for years at this point since the Mind Over Matter nerf to have any sort of decent build on it, with it being very squishy until you got to late game gear. But now with the Mina rework that's happening to Sorc, massively increasing its damage and massively increasing its survivability, especially in the early game, it is time for this build to come out. It's time for it to be one of the single best season starters you can play. One of the things I love most about it is the simplicity of the build. While there are some uniques that are going to be very powerful in the build, none are actually required to play it, meaning that you're not waiting on anything for your build to really get going. The other nice thing is because we're going to be a mana stacker and the only stat we really truly care about is going to be mana, not only can you just watch your mana globe and every time it gets bigger, you know your build is overall better, but in terms of gearing everything, it's going to be very simple because you're just looking for that one stat. With all this put together, it should be a really fun build given that our teleport is going to have a very low cooldown, making us be able to get around very quickly, as well as us being able to have permanent haste, meaning that overall this build should be really fast while clearing, make it very enjoyable to do quite a lot of monoliths on it. Now, before we go any further, I do want to mention that this build guide will be accompanied by a following written guide on last Epoch tools. This is by far the single biggest written guide I've ever made, and I highly implore you to go read through it. This should have every single little bit of information that you need that is covered in this video, and it's going to go into a little bit more detail on some of the things that we simply just cannot fit into a 20-minute video. If you have any questions, I would highly recommend to read through this, as I put a lot of time and effort to make this as good as I can. It's going to completely guide you through everything you need to know, including how to level and how the core mechanics of this build are going to work. It is also going to be accompanied with a build planner that is going to show you all the gear that you need here, along with your passive tree and an interactive slider showing you exactly where to put all of your passive points for both the passives on your skill tree and all the passives of the skills themselves. Finally, there will be a handmade loot filter for you to utilize as well, which will be linked in the description below, which is designed to hold your hand through all of the leveling process, showing you the exact gear that you want to see. For endgame, there will also be an endgame filter linked in the description below via the Allie filter, which I made last season, which is a highly configurable filter that can in minutes be configured to show you exactly the stats that you want on exactly the gear that you want. So the first thing that we should talk about is going to be how you're going to be leveling this build. Unfortunately, we cannot play our skill until about level 25 or so. You are going to unlock Meteor as soon as you become a Sorcerer, but it's going to be too weak for you to immediately use. Instead, we're going to be playing with Glacier from the moment we unlock it all the way up until we are ready to swap over to Meteor. To be able to start playing Glacier, you're going to need to spend 5 passive points in the Mage tree, meaning until then, you're going to be playing with a specialized Fireball, where you're going to be picking up points in Conflagration for the increased ignite damage as your single target, and an unspecialized Elemental Nova for your AoE. Once you do unlock Glacier, we are then going to be specializing into it, and we're going to be picking up 2 points into Breaking Point, 1 point to Greater Destruction, 4 points into Mortis's Bane, and then finishing off by picking up more points into Greater Destruction until we are ready to swap over to Meteor. Glacier is going to be an amazing skill to level with because it's going to not only consistently stun and chill enemies, but it's also going to do a very large amount of damage in AoE around you, allowing you to instantly one-shot most packs. One thing to mention about Glacier is that it's going to have a very high mana cost. This is actually a good thing because the new Sorcerer Mastery is going to give us 1% more damage per 2 costs on the skill, meaning that Glacier should be doing somewhere around 25% more damage than it was in the previous seasons. In terms of how you're going to be leveling with this, you're simply going to try group up as many monsters as you can, and then simply just pressing 1 Glacier should be enough to kill everything in the pack. You are going to be having mana problems, which is why we're going to be pairing this up with Mana Strike. Until level 8, you're just going to be playing with an unspecialized Mana Strike, and then at level 8, we're going to be specializing into their second slot, picking up 3 points into Arcane Blade, followed by 4 points into Swift Sap, 1 point in Starve Strikes, 2 points in Reclamation, and 4 points in Mana Drain. From here, you're just going to be pressing a Glacier, you're going to be going and then you're just simply going to be pressing Mana Strike. Ideally, you want to make yourself go out of mana as much as possible because Reclamation is going to give you a massive boost to your mana gained while out of mana once you do pick it up. If you do end up having any stragglers in a pack, try to bring them into the next pack to not waste your mana on just killing 1 or 2 monsters. Usually everything should die in 1 Glacier, but you might need a second or a third for any sort of rare monsters. In terms of the gear that you're going to want while leveling, it's going to be very simple. There is one word that we care about, and that is mana. If an item has mana on it, you're going to equip it. Mana is the lifeblood of this build, healing both our defenses and at the same time giving us a bigger mana pool to allow us to spam our abilities for longer. Ideally, you want to make sure you're also picking up any sort of mana shards that you find, and you want to make sure you craft onto your gear and upgrade all of your mana rolls as much as you can. You aren't going to really need much health on your gear, as we're going to have a pretty large ward pool taking care of most of the damage that we take, but do try to get a few health rolls as much as you can in the early game until your ward starts ramping to very high amounts. Mana Shell, which is something you're going to be unlocking as soon as you swap over to a Sorcerer, is going to give you 1 word per second per 10 maximum mana that you have. At around level 20, when you have 5 passive points in it, your goal should be about 200 total mana. 100 of this mana is going to come from you just being around level 20, 50 of it is going to come from your Sorcerer passive, and then the other 50 or so should be from your gear. Obviously, it's going to be RNG how much total mana you get from your gear, but if you have around 200 total mana, you're going to feel very comfy. With that much total mana, you're going to have around 30 word per second, and this, with a little bit of intelligence and a little bit of word retention on the rest of your tree, should stabilize at about 200 word or so. This should basically double your total health pool, and that word should pretty much for the most part take care of any sort of early game defense you need. You're going to still want to keep scaling your mana because later on we're going to be getting Lost Knowledge, which is going to give you a portion of your current mana as ward every time you cast your Meteor and your Glacier. It's not going to be very good early on as you're going to constantly be at very low mana, but as you do get more mana, this will get better as your mana pool deepens, meaning you're sitting at high mana values for longer. The other thing to mention here that is going to be very important for both Glacier and Meteor is to make sure you pay attention to your weapon. Glacier and Meteor have extremely high effectiveness of added damage, and the only way to get added damage for spells is through the spell damage implicites on your weapons. These are going to be substantially more important than any other rolls that you can get, such as elemental damage, fire damage, cold damage, or spell damage, and it is highly worth it for you to drop your weapon for a new one that has a substantially higher spell damage roll, as that is going to increase your damage more than any other stat possibly could. Make sure you keep paying attention to the weapons on the ground, and please keep upgrading your weapons to not have any issues with your damage. Next, let's talk about how to actually swap over to Meteor. As I mentioned, you're going to want to wait and put a few passive points into your Meteor before swapping over. The reason for this being that we need both Aftermath, which is going to contribute a significant portion of your mana recovery, as well as us needing at least Twin Meteor and 1 point Meteor Shower to make the AoE of Meteor be comparable to Glacier. Because Meteor is going to cost substantially more mana with Twin Meteor, we really need these additional meteors to really get the most out of each skill. The way you're mostly going to be clearing with Meteor is pretty much the same as you were with Glacier. You're going to use 1 Meteor in a pack, and it might take you a little bit of time to get used to delay before the hit actually goes through, and then you're simply going to move on to the next one. If there's a few stragglers, don't bother killing them, and just simply drag them into the next pack and then just Meteor everything together. And if you need to, press a second or maybe a third to kill any sort of rare. You really want to be a little bit frugal with your Meteor cast, as we're going to be abusing Aftermath to gain the majority of our mana back while clearing. Because Meteor's mana cost is just so damn high to begin with, that recovery from Aftermath is going to be where most of your mana recovery is going to come from in the early game until you get yourself into a higher mana level and get other passives such as Archmage. It's not going to be as big of a problem, but early on you really do need to capitalize on Aftermath as much as you can. This is very simple to do. Just simply don't press too many meteors and just try to get used to only pressing 1 or 2 meteors at most per pack that you go to. To accompany this, as Aftermath won't by itself take care of everything, we are going to be specializing into Focus. Unspecialize out of your Glacier and specialize into Focus, and then with Focus, whenever you do finally go out of mana, this will pretty much top you back up in 2 seconds. The important thing to mention about Focus is that you need to channel it for at least 1 second. If you do that, you will gain a burst of ward that is both a flat amount and a portion of your missing mana, making that 1 second burst really important. You are also going to be picking up Energy Infusion, which is going to give you haste for 1 second for 20 mana that you gain while channeling. Because of this, we really need to get that burst going, as this should pretty much always max out this, making it not feel that bad that you have to constantly stop and channel Focus for 1 second, given that the 10 seconds of haste is going to massively make up for it. Another thing to keep in mind is going to be Desperate Meditation, which is going to give you 1% mana regeneration per 1 flat mana you're missing, meaning you really want to get yourself as low as possible before starting channeling your Focus, and No Perfusion, giving you 20% of your maximum mana if you started casting it while negative. This is going to be a very important core concept of this, that you want to get yourself into negative mana with Meteor before channeling your Focus. No Perfusion is going to be a very large portion of your total mana gain, especially as you move into the late game, because this is always going to give you 20% of your total maximum mana, which is going to be scaled up to 40% with Null Infusion as you put more points into the skill. A very simple way of accomplishing this is by allowing yourself to get to low mana, pressing another Meteor to get yourself into negatives, and if your reaction time isn't fast enough to start your Focus immediately as soon as you get to low mana, let yourself get back up to positive mana, sitting at around maybe 10 or 20 total mana, and then press 1 more Meteor to tank yourself down to over negative 100 mana, giving you a very large period for you to then press your Focus to not miss out on the negative mana window. To add on to all this, we're going to also be accompanying our Meteor with a bunch of utility skills that are going to make our build overall better. What I would highly recommend for you to do is to keep your Mana Strike specialized until you get comfortable with only pressing Focus for mana, and once you do feel comfortable dropping Mana Strike completely from your tree, you should then unspecialize it and specialize into Flame Ward. Flame Ward is going to give you a 30% damage reduction for 3 seconds after pressing it, as well as giving you a large burst of ward. The reason we're going to want Flame Ward is because we can get Thorough Flames, which is going to give us a large amount of flat damage. And again, because Meteor has a 900% effectiveness of add damage, it's going to massively increase the damage that you do, when combined with Infusion, which is going to give you 250% increased fire damage. But we can also pair this up with Prismatic Buffer, giving us less elemental damage taken, and Barrier, further increasing the less damage that we're going to be taking while Flame Ward is active. Flame Ward is by far the best button that Mage has, and I would highly recommend for you to numlock it. If you don't know how to numlock, there'll be a video in the description below giving you a very quick 2-minute guide on how exactly to set up a numlock, as you just simply want Flame Ward to go off every single time it's off a cooldown. We are then going to also be specializing into Teleport, which is one of the single best mobility skills in the game, offering both a very short cooldown and a large variety of buffs that are going to make your build better. We're going to be picking up Stable Bubble, which is going to give you 50% ward retention for 4 seconds after casting Teleport, as well as Elemental Affinity, giving you 50% increased damage. We're then going to be picking up Time Dilation and making these buffs last 100% longer, meaning that for 8 seconds after pressing Teleport, you're going to just have a large amount of ward retention, a large amount of damage. The final skill that we're going to be adding to our arsenal is going to be Arcane Ascendance. This is going to be a skill that is not only going to allow us to cheese the new rework of Bossier, but it's also going to allow us to become a living nuke, giving us a large amount of increased spell damage and increased cast speed. This increased cast speed is going to be crucial as you push into the mid and end game, you're going to have so much mana that's going to be very difficult for you to actually go through all of it in a very quick succession. Arcane Ascendance will root down in place when you activate it, but that's not going to be an issue given that you can still teleport while rooted down. And if worst comes to worst, you can just immediately recast the ability to prematurely end a root, allowing you to immediately move. There's no sort of delay or cast time or any sort of quirkiness with Arcane Ascendance, making it very smooth to use and nothing you should worry about in terms of you potentially dying to a boss because you were rooted in place. A big concept that you're going to have to keep in mind for bosses is going to be their rotation is going to slightly change. What you're going to want to do whenever you face a boss is to immediately Arcane Ascendance yourself, hold down your Meteor key until you completely go out of mana. As soon as you do hit negative mana, your Arcane Ascendance will end no matter what, and then you're just simply going to sit there and channel your focus. As I mentioned, Bossier is being changed this season to, instead of bosses gaining damage reduction as you burst them down, at certain thresholds they're going to gain a massive amount of ward that is going to decay over time. If we can time this ward threshold happening as we hit low mana, we can then just sit there and channel our focus to gain all of our mana back, effectively giving us a large amount of additional DPS, as we couldn't be DPSing during that period anyways, we would just be gaining mana, versus other builds who would just have to sit there and hit through the ward. This is a very unique thing about this build, and it's not really something that is super crucial to think about or remember, but it is a nice quirk that technically makes us actually abuse Bossier to overall increase our damage. It might take you a few bosses to get used to the playstyle, and if you do have to end your Arcane Ascendance prematurely, just keep spamming your meteors until you do bring yourself to negative mana, and then just focus yourself back up, and then try to get yourself a window where you can Arcane Ascendance and properly dump all your mana during it. One thing I want to quickly talk about in case you're worried about it is going to be Cunning. Sure, Cunning will increase the total cooldown of your Arcane Ascendance, but just due to the way this is going to feel in the endgame with your mana pool being so large, is that by the time you finish using up all of your mana, and then while you're sitting there channeling and maybe dodging a boss ability or two, your Arcane Ascendance should immediately come back up. You might have a point where you have to wait a second or two before you can actually press it if you do gain your mana back a little bit too fast, but really shouldn't be that big of a worry, and in my opinion, it's just a really fun playstyle. Next, let's start talking about our defensive layers in this build and how to properly scale them into the endgame. Mana Shell is going to be a big proprietor of where a lot of your ward is going to come from. This is going to give you 1 ward per second per 10 maximum mana that you have. As we start pushing this build into the end game and start hitting up to 2000 mana, that means we're going to be gaining 200 ward per second from this alone. Because of this, we just want to keep scaling as much mana as we can, and that mana that we're scaling is also just going to allow us to press more meteors before we do run out of mana. This is also going to synergize really well with Lost Knowledge. Lost Knowledge is going to give you a burst of ward every single time you press Meteor based on the current mana that you have. Finally, as you are dumping your mana, we are also going to have Mana Well, which is going to give you 50% of all the mana that you spend as ward. Between these 3 things together, you're constantly generating lots and lots of wards from different sources, making your total ward pool feel very large. Lastly, we're going to be adding in Transient Rest, which is going to give you up to 60% of your current mana as ward every single time you stop moving. This stop moving requirement is very easy to actually do because anything from sitting there and channeling your focus, or casting your meteor, or pressing Arcane Ascendance, or even just teleporting counts as you stopping your movement, meaning that on average you should have somewhere around 80 to 90% efficiency of this 2-second cooldown. It's not going to be something you're gonna have to worry about, and if you want to think about in terms of a ward per second value, Transient Rest should be worth somewhere around about 1,000 ward per second on average, making it very powerful. You're going to feel very tanky without it, but Transient Rest should be one of the first things that you go and rush and get yourself, as it is just a massive increase to our total defenses. Because of all of these scalers based off of mana is by far the single most important stat for you to stack, and it's going to really be the only thing you have to worry about in this build. In my opinion, that's going to make it very fun, because that way you just get to stare at your mana globe and you get the satisfaction of knowing as your mana goes up, your whole build overall is getting better. And because of that, it's going to be the main focus of the stats that you want to get on your weapon, your offhand, your helmet, your chest plates, gloves, and your relic. Try to do everything you can to find yourself a high mana roll, and this would ideally be the exalted affix that you're going to be going for on each of these slots. One thing to mention about your weapon specifically is there are now 2 mana mods that can roll at the same time. You're ideally going to want to either use a wand or a scepter, but as you start min-maxing this build, you really need to make sure you swap over to a wand. Wands get access to both the hybrid mana and mana regen mod and the new hybrid mana and mana spend gain as word mod. Scepters only have the gain as word mod on them, meaning that in the end game you will have a smaller mana pool if you end up going with the scepter at no additional benefit. The other really important stat that you're going to want to stack is going to be mana regeneration. This is only going to be able to be found on your belts, your rings, and your amulets, but it is going to be the #1 priority in those slots, with the exception of your amulets, where it's going to be #2 to flat mana. This stat, especially if you can get your hands on it in the early monolith progression, is going to make it feel really comfortable, as a large portion of where our mana recovery is going to come from in this build is going to be you picking up Archmage. Archmage is going to refund 20% of all mana that you spend, which is guaranteed assuming you have over 1,000 mana. This is a breakpoint that you want to do everything you can to reach, as the difference between you being at this 1,000 mana breakpoint and not being at this 1,000 mana breakpoint is going to be massive in terms of your mana economy. As long as you keep focusing on this one stat all over the place, you literally cannot be building the build incorrectly, and you'll always be making progression towards making your build overall stronger. Finally, on your chest plates, we are going to be able to get ourselves additional levels of Meteor, which is going to actually take precedence over increased maximum mana, as these 4 additional levels of Meteor are going to give you a stupid amount of additional DPS. Meteor loves additional levels, and every single one of these additional levels is going to feel very impactful. Try to get yourself an exalted roll on your chest plate as quickly as you can. Simply running a tier 6 or tier 7 flat mana roll with a tier 5 meteor roll is also okay until you find yourself something really good in the end game. The final very important concept to keep in mind here is going to be your gloves. We are going to be wanting to run Frostbite Shackles in this build, as it's going to be a great way for us to make our ward last a lot longer. It's going to be a primary way that we're going to be able to push our ward up into 10,000 plus. And even post nerfs in 1.1, these gloves are just way too good not to use. Once you do get your hand on a pair of Frostbite Shackles, you're going to try to prioritize as much cold resistance as you can on every single suffix that you can fit it on. In the mid game of this build, this might not be very feasible, as your gear might not be min-maxed yet, so you're going to be having lots of random resistance rolls all over the place. But as you do push into the end game, you should be able to min-max your resistances in such a way to where you should be able to fit cold resistance on every single slot. This is going to effectively be your second scaler next to mana in terms of being able to make yourself tankier. Mana still takes precedence here, as it's going to give you substantially more ward than the ward retention from cold resistance would give you, but this should be something that you keep in the back of your mind and try to do everything you can to maximize. One thing that might help you be able to get a little bit more cold resistance in the mid game is to make sure you're focusing on getting as much resistance as you can on your blessing. Your blessings are a great way for you to take care of some of your resistances for you, but I wouldn't worry about getting yourself min-max resistances yet, as with the new Forgotten faction that's coming out in 1.1, at rank 8, all blessings that you're going to find are going to roll twice, with the highest roll being kept. I would just get yourself a baseline half decent blessing in every slot, and then go and get yourself better blessings once you do actually get this rank, as it'll make getting max rolled blessings substantially faster. Finally, the last thing I want to mention here is going to be Twisted Heart. Now, this build is going to include Twisted Heart, but this does not mean it is absolutely required to play this build. It is simply just the single best relic that we can use, as normal relics, while being okay, don't give you additional levels to skills. +1 to all skills is going to make it substantially better than any other option, and at the same time, we are actually going to really want the cast speed that provides. Because of all this, and because we have Lavamancer giving us Fire Leech, there's pretty much no reason for us not to utilize it, giving us an additional little boost to our total ward. Again, Twisted Heart is absolutely not required in the slightest in this build, and you can get away with just using any other relic just fine without you ever going and pursuing a Twisted Heart. It's just, if you were to want to optimize this build, it would be the ideal relic for you to use. To wrap up our gear, let's talk about the items that you're going to want. Luckily, the items in this build are very simplistic because all we care about is mana. Due to this, you're going to want to get yourself 4 grand glass idols with flat mana and percent mana on every single one of them. It's going to be very simple to see if a idol is going to be a DPS increase or not, because you're simply just going to equip it. If your total mana goes up in comparison to a different glass idol, great, it's an upgrade. If it doesn't make your mana go up, then it might not necessarily be an upgrade. We're also going to have enough space for us to be able to run a 2x2, and in this 2x2, you're either going to run a idol with ward retention and cold resistance on it once you get yourself Frostbite Shackles, or ideally, in the late game, you're going to be running a Throne of Ambition. This relic is going to be giving you more fire damage every single second, up to 20, meaning that by the end of a boss fight, you should be able to get yourself 40% increased damage. Now, realistically, you're never going to really fully utilize this, as you're just going to kill everything before it fully ramps up. But due to the amount of damage it's going to give you, it is going to be better than any other option in this 2x2 if you are looking to min-max and increase your damage as much as you can. Finally, you're going to have a few additional slots all over the place. And what I'd recommend for you to do with these is to fit in as many 1x1 Lagonian idols with flat mana and any resistance that you need on them. With all of this, you should have everything you need to know to be able to put this build together, and you should be able to go on your way to happily destroy everything on screen and just have fun listening to the satisfying sounds the meteors make. I am so excited to play this build for the next season, and with all the new unique items that they've showcased that are going to be added in 1.1, there's actually quite a lot of min-maxing to do in this build, and I'm excited to do exactly what we did last season in community with the Falconer build, where we all just came together and slowly min-maxed it and made it better over time. This build is looking to be very spicy for the season, and if you do end up playing it yourself, I hope you enjoy it and I hope you have a lot of fun with it, because it's going to be very simple and just very satisfying. If you do have any questions on anything that we went over here, please feel free to leave a comment in the comments below, and I'd be more than happy to help you as soon as I can. I'm also going to be streaming this build on Twitch every single day for the launch of the season, and if you're watching this video before the season comes out, we'll be doing quite a lot of practice runs on it to get myself and everyone else ready for it. You can simply just come and drop by Twitch and ask your question there if you want it answered live, or if you simply just want to come and join all the other cuties and be a part of my community, I'd be more than happy to see you there as well. With that said, I hope you cuties enjoyed the video. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I'll see you all in the next video.